ancestors. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, the walls come tumbling down. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, and the walls come. So it's great to see everybody today. I know there are a few people who couldn't make it today and are going to listen to and watch the recording. So I appreciate those of you who are here with us live. We are going to start with the blessing, and then we will dive right into talking about the walls that will come tumbling down finally this week. So let's start with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ruach haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, mitzivanu
la'asok
b'divrei Torah. Let's soak ourselves in the words of Torah. Okay, so this is a bit of a difficult class. This was a hard class to prepare for because we are getting into the meat of the book of Joshua, where the Israelites are conquering the land, and in many cases, they are slaughtering the resident people. They're doing it on the basis of promises that were made to them in the Torah and with divine support. Or, if you read it a very different way, as Winston Churchill said, that history is written by the victors, the support of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is justification for the wholesale annihilation of innocent civilians, along with the military troops who were defending their own homeland from invaders. So it's very hard to say what we are reading about here in the context of our modern sensibilities. But for now, at least as we go through the text to start with, we're going to take the biblical perspective and look at the text from a somewhat traditional standpoint. We'll also discuss some scientific and archaeological perspectives, and we'll leave room for discussion of morality from a 21st century lens, and also talk a little bit about whether that's a valid way of looking at these events. So let me share the class notes. We're going to start with a transition from the end of the last chapter to the beginning of this one. And let's start with Arlene. I'll ask you to read about the warrior angel.
Once, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a figure standing before him, drawn sword in hand. Joshua went up to him and asked him, "Are you one of us or of our enemies?" He replied, "No, I am captain of God's host. Now I have come." Joshua threw himself face down to the ground and prostrating himself, said to him, "Why does my Lord command his servant?" The captain of God's host answered Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was shut up tight because of the Israelites. No one could leave or enter.
Thank you. So the warrior angel is a transition who indicates that God is going to allow his Israelites to prevail over the city of Jericho, and that this is what is supposed to happen. And he says, take your shoes off, you're on holy ground. And this is what Moses was told at the burning bush. So once again, this links Moses and Joshua together as we have seen before.
And perhaps he does this as a reminder of the holiness of the mission, because Joshua knows that he is going to have to go and kill a lot of people. Or maybe this is just us retrojecting our sensibilities backwards. But I think it's kind of impossible for us not to do that, especially in the times that we are dealing with right now, when we are thinking a lot about the slaughter of innocent people, the death of people that we wish were not collateral damage in what we think of as perhaps justifiable and perhaps not at all justifiable warfare. The book that I have quoted before, and I'm going to quote again, we're going to read what Michael Hatton has to say about Joshua, the challenge of the promised land. Diane, can you read this next section?
Yes, but before I do, when
Yes.
this figure says he's the captain of God's host, is it an angel? What is, I mean, it's
Yeah.
not defined.
No, it's not defined. And angels tend not to identify themselves as angels, but because because of the way they identify themselves, the captain of God's host, we assume that this is an angel. The same way that other angels appear to other figures in the Torah, and certainly the depictions of this occurrence show this personage as an angel with wings, as you'll see in the picture that I showed here. Um,
Yeah,
and and Joshua is the captain of the earthly army. So we assume this is an angel.
got it. Yeah, that's what I thought. I mean,
Yeah.
because I saw the wings.
Yep.
But anyway, um, Joshua and Israel will prevail. The city of Jericho will fall, and the Canaanites will be defeated. But the people and their victorious armies must never lose sight of the land's sanctity, of a man's inherent worth, of the vision of a better world in which warfare is archaic and killing obsolete. Canaan's city-states, materially advanced and cultured though they were, never succeeded in advancing that vision even one tiny increment because it was an ideal that was antithetical to their polytheistic values. The angel of the Lord, however, addressing Joshua on Jericho's outskirts, makes it absolutely clear that his mission must be different. God may countenance justified bloodshed, but he will not tolerate wanton cruelty. The concept of Canaan's hallowed earth implies an intimation of the divine and a corresponding necessity to tread lightly upon that land with greater care and heightened sensitivity. What is tolerable and considered natural in other lands, mainly viciousness, violence, and cold-hearted cruelty, all committed in the name of victory, is wrong when perpetrated by God's nation and out of place when committed in the land that is the focal point of God's concern.
Keep going.
Support for this reading is found in the paragraph breaks of the original Hebrew text, which connects the angel's message of holiness to the conquest about to unfold. The angel comes to communicate not only a divine assistance, but also God's demand for responsibility and decency. It is as if the angel says in the name of God, fight against Jericho and defeat it, but never forget that you must not surrender your humanity in the process. Overcome the foe. Do not perpetrate acts of gratuitous violence in defeating him or gloat over his downfall. These are critical lessons for a people about to initiate a war of conquest.
Okay. So I think that what Michael Hatton has to say here is wonderful. Do you see this in the text? Or do you wish you saw it in the text?
Ah, good question.
The text doesn't say much.
No.
It just says this place is holy, remove your sandals from your feet. And then it mentions Jericho was shut up tight because of the Israelites. No one could leave or enter, which leads you to believe that the Israelites had shut it up. In other words, they were having a siege in place against this particular city.
Perhaps, although I will remind you of what we learned about a few weeks ago, actually, it's over a month ago, that the people of Jericho were afraid of the Israelites.
Oh,
Remember, they knew the Israelites were coming, and maybe they had shut themselves in.
mm,
No one could leave or enter. They were shut up tight
right,
because they knew the Israelites were
right,
coming.
right.
What he was talking about down here, where he said the original Hebrew text paragraph breaks,
Hmm.
that if you look at the text in the Hebrew, you'll see that between the end of the last verse of um, chapter 5 and the first verse of chapter 6, there's no space.
Oh,
It doesn't start on a new line. It actually starts on a new line after line 1 of chapter 6. So what Hatton is saying is that the chapter breaks, which weren't put in biblical times, they were actually added in medieval times, and they were added by Christian commentators,
interesting.
um, are not necessarily paying very much attention to what we would think of as the text. And that this line about Jericho being shut up tight because of the Israelites belongs with this paragraph of text and not with the next one.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure that that means what Michael Hatton is trying to make it mean.
Well, it's a nice theory though, because
Yes.
I mean, we are a humanistic people, and we are not supposed to torture our enemies or um, you know, sexually abuse them or what have you, things that are done to prisoners,
Yes.
uh, by other nations.
And you will see when we get to what happens that the killing of the people of Jericho does not involve torture. It does not involve taking them as slaves. It does not involve sexual abuse. It does not involve kidnapping, which is by Jewish law, kidnapping is actually as bad as murder.
Mm.
It does not involve putting them in tunnels for hundreds of days.
Yeah, sounds
It does
familiar.
not involve cruelty. It is swift, um,
Merciful.
merciful on a certain level.
I
Uh,
mean, in other words, the way we kill animals for food is merciful.
yes, if one has to kill animals for food or
Right,
chooses to have to,
right.
which let's acknowledge that there are vegans among us, and some make the decision that that is not a necessary part of life. But if one chooses to, the choice to do it in as merciful a method as possible makes sense, I suppose. So, yes, we will see that it is done swiftly. It does anyone else have comments about this before I say more about what I think is going on in Michael Hatton's brain here? Arlene or Robin, any thoughts? So it feels to me like Hatton's description, he's grasping at straws a little bit. He's trying to find a way to justify this. He sees the angel as saying, fight against Jericho and defeat them, don't surrender your humanity in the process. These are critical lessons in a war of conquest. But I certainly wish that we had learned that lesson and we could learn this lesson now, and that the whole world could learn this lesson. So I want to take a detour for just a minute and talk about the different kinds of war in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish tradition, and see how they're categorized by their purpose and their justification and divine sanction. There are two main types of war in biblical and rabbinical literature, and one of them is called Milchemet Mitzvah, and the other one is Milchemet Reshut. One is an obligatory war, and the other one is a discretionary or an optional war. So a Milchemet Mitzvah, an obligatory war, is considered a divine commandment. It's obligatory for all of Israel. Participation is mandatory, even for those who are normally exempt from military service. And some of the examples of it are the war against Amalek and the wars of conquest of Canaan, specifically Jericho, but all the rest of the wars that we're going to read about in the rest of the book of Joshua. And there are later defensive wars like the war of the Maccabees against the Greeks, which are often categorized as obligatory war because self-defense is considered a religious duty. And you will hear current conversation around whether what has been going on in Israel is a Milchemet Mitzvah or a Milchemet Reshut. A discretionary war is not explicitly commanded by God, but it's waged for political, territorial, or defensive reasons. It originally required divine consultation, which meant that the high priest would consult with the Urim and Tumim, which we don't really know exactly what they are, but they might have been symbols that were sort of a little bit like rolling dice or consulting some kinds of spiritual things that one had and could hold in one's hands. And later it required approval by the Sanhedrin. King David's military campaigns and later the campaigns by the kings of Israel that were used to expand Israel's borders were discretionary wars. In discretionary wars, there were exemptions for newlyweds, for someone who had recently built a house or had planted a vineyard or a field and had not yet gotten any of the bounty from it yet, or in fact, someone who was afraid. And it was very interesting because when people were asked if they met any of the exemptions, they did not have to self-identify which of the exemptions they met. They were just listed, here are the exemptions, and if you meet one of the exemptions, you could step up. So people did not have to say, oh, I'm afraid. They just had to say, I meet one of the exemptions, and they were exempt, which I think was a really wonderful thing to remember, because one of the important mitzvot is not to ever embarrass someone. Embarrassing someone is considered a lot like committing murder because you are publicly shaming them. And Milchemet Reshut is also done for political or economic gain and is not done by divine command. So certainly the conquest of Canaan is in the list of obligatory wars. There are also some other kinds of wars that we hear about elsewhere. Wars of divine punishment or judgment. These are against nations that have sinned. They're different from the other two kinds of wars because they are not done by human military action, but are purely miraculous, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the plagues and the drowning of the Egyptian army. And in some later texts, there is an expectation that at the end of days, there will be an apocalyptic or messianic war involving the nations coming to war against Israel, like the war of Gog and Magog that is in the book of Ezekiel, and the final battle that is described in the book of Zechariah.
Some feel that's going on right now.
Yes, some think that that is the beginning of what's happening now. But we are going to move on. We are going to read about God's instructions. So, Akiva, would you like to read the instructions from the Holy One loudly, please?
Joshua 6:2-5. God said to Joshua, "See, I will deliver Jericho into your hands, its kings and warriors. Let all your troops march around the city and complete one circuit of the city. Do this 6 days with 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns preceding the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with priests blowing the horns. And when a long blast is sounded on the horn, as soon as you hear that sound of the horn, all the troops shall give a mighty shout. And thereupon the city wall will collapse, and the troops shall advance, every man straight ahead."
Okay, thank you. So we've got God's specific instructions that are given to Joshua. This encirclement is psychological warfare against the inhabitants of the city, who will watch with alarm as the Israelites file by silently, led by what they will see as a symbol of the Israelite God, followed by the shrill sound of the ram's horn. And of course, there are lots of sevens.
And the ark is being marched around.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
I
The
don't think most
symbol.
people know that.
Yes, the ark is being marched around. That's a symbol of God. So there are lots of sevens. So, Robin, will you read about what Radak has to say about the sevens?
Make sure I get this up. Okay. So you shall do for 6 days. Don't ask the reason for the decision of the Creator, why there was need for this encircling, and the reason for the 7 priests, the 7 shofars, the 7 circles, and the 7 days. The reason for the circle with the teruah blast is to separate the people that were in the city, and the wall will fall under it, so that all the nations of the land will know that HaShem is fighting for Israel, not with sword or spear. The number 7 has great meaning in science, like the 7 altars and the 7 sacrificial cows. And 7 is also the chosen number for the counting days and for the natural world.
Yes, thank you. So we have so many sevens in our tradition: days of the week, branches of the menorah, the number of days in Passover and Sukkot, and the weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, the years of planting before we have the Shemitah, We use 7 over and over again, and this was symbolic to the Israelite people that God was on the side of this victory, that they would prevail not through their own physical force, but because God was the one who was making it happen. And there's also a tradition that says that the warfare in Canaan to finish conquering the land continued for 7 years. So now we're going to continue to read the next few sections just to get moving on through. Arlene, will you read what Joshua tells the priests?
Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant and let 7 priests carrying 7 rams' horns precede the ark of God." And he instructed the troops, "Go forward, march around the city with the vanguard marching in front of the ark of God." When Joshua had instructed the troops, the 7 priests carrying 7 rams' horns advanced before God, blowing their horns, and the ark of God's covenant followed them. The vanguard marched in front of the priests who were blowing the horns, and the rear guard marched behind the ark, with the horns sounding all the time. But Joshua's orders to the rest of the troops were, "Do not shout, do not let your voices be heard, and do not let a sound issue from your lips until the moment that I command you. Shout, then you shall shout."
Thank you. So we've got these different sets of people. We have people from each of the tribes. So all of the Israelites are represented in this group. Then let's go on, and those were the instructions. So now it begins. So Diane, why don't you read the next section?
Okay, Joshua 6:11-14. So he had the ark of God go around the city and complete 1 circuit. Then they returned to camp and spent the night in camp. Joshua rose early the next day, and the priests took up the ark of God, while the 7 priests bearing the 7 rams' horns marched in front of the ark of God, blowing the horns as they marched. The vanguard marched in front of them, and the rear guard marched behind the ark of God, with the horns sounding all the time. And so they marched around the city once on the 2nd day and returned to the camp. They did this 6 days.
Great. Okay. And one more. So, Robin, can you read 7 on 7?
On the 7th day, they rose at daybreak and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. That was the only day that they marched around the city 7 times.
Thank you. Okay, so we usually have a lot of Rashi commentaries on everything, but there is hardly any Rashi on the entire section of the fall of Jericho. So I wanted to figure out why that was, and I looked it up, and here are some reasons. He usually focuses on simple interpretation of things that are complicated and on delving more deeply into the meanings behind what's going on, including highlighting divine intervention. But it's all right here in the narrative. And so he must not have felt that there was anything necessary for him to explicate. There are no fine points of law to be explained, and the Torah's account of the events didn't leave very much that needed detailed explanation or analysis. But we will have a little bit coming up soon. And now we have a bit from him, which he points out and which actually came out as a question to me, which is, what's the Rashi here, Akiva?
This was on the Shabbos.
Right. So why do you think he points out that this big day of the war was on Shabbos?
Because they didn't blow the horns.
Mm,
Maybe. It doesn't say they blew the horns.
mm. This is actually the big day, happens on Shabbos.
Oh, oh, that's unusual.
Yeah, I think. Well, anybody else? Any other ideas?
Well, the story goes that the horn was blown and the walls came tumbling down. So
Yeah.
technically, there was no active fighting, but the horns did it all. God did.
Well, I think that what's going on here is that, yes, go ahead.
Could this
No,
be
that's all.
It is pointing out that
We don't kill on Shabbos.
no,
No.
that if it is a mitzvah,
right?
it overrides the Shabbat. An
Got it.
obligatory war does not wait for Shabbos.
Oh, interesting.
If we have to make war, it doesn't wait for Shabbos.
Interesting. Yes. And Israel is doing that right now.
You bet.
One
You
of
bet.
the things that trumps, to use a bad word, trumps Shabbos is Pekuah Nefesh.
Yep.
And one might say that this kind of a war is Pekuah Nefesh because you are defending your own, it's self-defense, which is
Yes.
a kind of Pekuah Nefesh.
Absolutely.
And that would fit in with this idea that
Okay.
you're proposing.
So we're going to move on, and I'm going to have Akiva read this next section, but look out for the word proscribed, which is a word that I needed to look up in the dictionary in English, and I also looked it up in Hebrew because it's a very interesting word. So Akiva, go ahead and read to us.
Will we find out the definition?
Oh, we will.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Joshua 6:16 through 20. On the seventh round, as the priests blew the horns, Joshua commanded the troops, "Shout, for God has given you the city. The city and everything in it are to be proscribed for God. Only Rahab the prostitute is to be spared, and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers we sent. But you must be aware of which is proscribed, or else you will be proscribed. If you take anything from that which is proscribed, you will cause the camp of Israel to be proscribed. You will bring calamity upon it. All the silver and gold and objects of copper and iron are consecrated to God. They must go into the treasury of God." So the troops shouted when the horn was sounded. And when the troops heard the sound of the horns, they raised a mighty shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops rushed into the city, every man straight in front of him, and they captured the city.
Thank you. So, prescribed is not a word you hear in common conversation. So, here is the dictionary definition of proscribed. Oh, well, there's a picture of the walls going tumbling down. Prescribe. The verb prescribe, prescribing, it is a transitive verb. The first definition is to publish the name of as condemned to death with the property of the condemned forfeited to the state. And the second is to condemn or forbid as harmful or unlawful, prohibit. And there is a list of many synonyms for the word proscribe: prohibit, forbid, ban, outlaw, discourage, prevent, blah, 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 blah. Long, long list. However, the word in Hebrew is herem. Now, herem is a really interesting word.
Holy smokes.
The word in Hebrew is herem. Now, herem is a particularly interesting word. Let's skip over the middle definition, which is a net or a perforated thing. But herem has two opposite definitions. Herem can mean a thing that is devoted, dedicated, or banned or devotion, or a thing that has been utterly destroyed or appointed for utter destruction. Now, a word that has both a meaning and the opposite meaning is called a contronym. It's also known as an auto-antonym or a Janus word. Janus, like the guy with the two faces that are pointing in opposite directions, okay? These words have definitions that contradict themselves depending on the context in which they're used. And you probably can think of, if you think hard, but I will give you some contronyms in English, like cleave, which can mean to split apart, like to cleave wood, or to cling to, like to cleave to tradition or to cleave to another person. Dust can mean to dust, to remove dust from something, to dust the furniture, or to apply dust, like to dust a cake with sugar. Sanction can mean to allow or approve, that a law sanctions this action, or to penalize or punish, to cause economic sanctions. Left can mean departed, he left the room, or remaining, like there are 2 cookies left. Fast can mean move quickly, or it can mean fix in place, like to hold fast. Oversight can mean supervision, like that project was under her oversight, or it can mean an accidental failure to notice something, like a critical oversight. Trim can mean to add decorations, like to trim a Christmas tree, or it can mean to cut away, like to trim a hedge. So harem is, well, which does it mean? Really good question. So Rashi, again, this is one of the places where Rashi decides to weigh in. Rashi says, and the city shall be consecrated. It shall be sacred. For that day was the holy Shabbos, and it was therefore fitting that all the booty that was taken be holy. And then Everett Fox, our friend Everett Fox, and I do literally mean our friend Everett Fox, sees this phrase interestingly. He translates the word as devoted things, but he also sees it as devoted to destruction. And he also notices one of the places where the word is used in the middle as, instead of harem, he says, lest you feel desire. He says that the Masoretic text, which is the standard text, says, lest you are devoted to destruction, but he thinks that that is a scribal error. He thinks that it wasn't really hey resh mem. He really thinks that it was hey mem dalid. You know how a resh and a dalid look very similar. He thinks that it really was supposed to be hey mem dalid, and they got the dalid wrong instead of a resh, and then they switched the letters, and that it really was covet or desire. So he reads that sentence as, and you be careful regarding the devoted things, lest you feel desire and take them from the devoted thing, take from the devoted things and render the camp of Israel devoted to destruction. So in either case, it means don't take that stuff because you're going to get in trouble and bring disaster.
Putting someone in harem, is this the same word?
It is from the similar root. Yeah, I think so. I believe it is the same root, although actually I have to check. Yes, here we are with an update. Harem, chet mem resh, means all of the things we've just discussed. And it also means the highest level of censure in the Jewish community, being kicked out, being set apart, not being able to be part of the Jewish community, being put in cherem. Same word. I just find this so interesting that it could mean one thing or it could mean another. And it's just really unclear as to what the meaning is. But here we go, moving forward. And here is what ends up happening. So Diane, can you please read to us what happens in the destruction?
Joshua 6:21-27. They exterminated everything in the city with the sword, man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey. But Joshua bade the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into that prostitute's house and bring out the woman and all that belonged to her as you swore to her." So the young spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father and her mother, her brothers, and all that belonged to her. They brought out her whole family and left them outside the camp of Israel. They burned down the city and everything in it, but the silver and gold and the objects of copper and iron were deposited in the treasury of the house of God. Only Rahab the prostitute and her family were spared by Joshua, along with all that belonged to her, and she dwelt among the Israelites, as is still the case. For she had hidden the messengers that Joshua sent out to spy out Jericho. At that time Joshua pronounced this oath: "Anyone who undertakes to fortify this city of Jericho is hereby under God's curse. Its foundation shall be laid at the cost of their firstborn, and its gates set up at the cost of their youngest." God was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land.
Thank you. So, any thoughts about what we just read?
Well, great that they spared her and her family. They were good on their promise. But I think about, oddly enough, I think about how Israel has returned to Gaza, and they're systematically going through and getting rid of people or getting rid of structures, etc. That sort of thing is rooted in history or in a holy book. It's just that came to mind.
Yeah. Well, I know I hear you. I am struck, as I mentioned before in passing, but here it is. The fact that killing everyone in the city is a single sentence. And of course, the entire story here is encapsulated in 27 lines, so maybe that makes sense, but it seems that it's really quite perfunctory, and that there's a lot more time spent on saving Rahab and her family than there is on the lives of all of those people. And yeah, there are parallels here, right? We're spending a whole lot more time talking about saving people than we are about the lives that are lost. And there are reasons for that, but we need to remember the collateral damage. We really do. So I have some more thoughts, but I just want to give everybody time to process this for a minute and see if you have any more comments.
That is a lot of damage. Just reading the first line of how they exterminated everybody, including the animals. Why the animals? So they wouldn't have any food? But it surprises me, from all the calmness at the beginning, how they weren't harming anyone, and to be that violent now.
Yeah. Well, the book says they did it because of God's instructions. And as I said, this is a holy book. This is our people's history. And as Winston Churchill said, history is written by the victors. So we have to keep those in both of our hands and keep looking at it. We know the Torah's perspective on this. This is a city full of people who are never going to embrace the Holy One. There's only one good person in the city, that's Rahab. She and her family are saved. Unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, now the Holy One has a human army who can do the divine will. In Deuteronomy, we read that if a city embraces idolatry, it should be completely destroyed, laid desolate, and lay in ruins forever. And that's what Joshua is saying here, that the foundation should be laid, should be left. There should never be any rebuilding of the city of Jericho. And we are told that ever. And we're told that idolatry is the absolute worst thing that could ever happen. Michael Hatton said that this is not a racial and genocidal campaign of ethnic cleansing, but something else entirely. It is a war against idolatry. And that is what God is all about in several of these books, is that idolatry is what God is fighting against and what God is accusing the Israelite people of backsliding into, of not paying attention to their covenant with the Holy One, and instead ignoring all of the laws in the Torah, the most important ones being treating other people with kindness and respect and dignity. And here we are saying, well, if you're not going to treat people with kindness and respect and dignity, off with your head. It's a hard combination.
They've actually been saying that the longer they keep the hostages, the more land Israel will annex from Gaza. That is right now going on.
Yeah.
They are marching in and they are taking parts of Gaza away from the Strip.
Yeah. So it is difficult to balance. It is difficult to balance what's happening now. It is difficult to balance our feelings about these things that happened then. It is, I think, in some ways easier if one can say, it says it, and therefore it is true. And a lot harder for those of us who choose to look at it with a slightly different perspective. I'm not going to solve it for you. I'm just going to put it out there. I am, however, going to move on to just one more thing, two more things. First of all, so we were told, the Israelite people were told, don't take any of the stuff. It's all for God. But what happens? Robin, can you please read us the cliffhanger, the very beginning of Joshua 7?
There's always one.
Yep.
The Israelites, however, violated the prescription. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took of that which was prescribed, and God was incensed with the Israelites.
And so next week we will find out what happens. Da, 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 da! And now we will move on to talk about what we know from archaeological evidence about Jericho. There were excavations done at what is believed to be the site of Jericho at Tel Esutan. They've been going since the 19th century. The most famous excavations were led by the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. That's her right there. She uncovered evidence of the city's destruction layers, but her findings led to conclusions that, of course, differ from the biblical account. According to her findings, the walls of Jericho did collapse, but she thinks that it happened in around 1550 BCE, which is significantly earlier than the traditional biblical date of the conquest of Canaan, which is 1400 BCE. Additionally, Kenyon suggested that the city's destruction was likely caused by an earthquake rather than a miraculous event involving the Israelites. Her work indicated that the walls had already fallen before the supposed time of the Israelites' conquest. She also found burnt layers. She revealed evidence of burning at the site, which corresponds with the biblical account of the city having been burned after its walls fell. However, the dating of the destruction layer is a point of contention. There have been subsequent excavations that further examined the layers, and some have questioned her conclusions, particularly regarding the dating of the fall of Jericho. Some researchers argue there could have been discrepancies in her chronology, and the later destruction layers might have been appropriately ascribed to the biblical event. And there are various scholars who think that maybe it really did happen when the book says that it happened. There is a theory that an earthquake is what really happened. The region is known for seismic activity. An earthquake would fit with what happened in the book. But of course, there's no way of knowing if that's what really happened. There are theories that there were other natural disasters that could have caused the walls to fall, like floods or landslides, but those don't really jive with the biblical narrative. So we really don't know what happened. And there's also the possibility that this is a story that got enhanced in its writing, that it's not a strict historical account. And I believe that there's an awful lot in the Torah that we have never thought is a strict historical account, that it's a cultural memory. I've said before that the stories of our people are the stories that got told for years and years and centuries around campfires. And did they really happen exactly as they are told? Were they enhanced slightly? Were years and dates changed? It's impossible to go back and know exactly what happened and when it happened. What we do know is these are the stories of our people. And what we do know is that they didn't sugarcoat them. They didn't say, we marched into the town and everyone said, God is great, we're going to go along with that. There was death and there was destruction. What do we do with that? We have to find a way to say, yes, those are our people. We've got a lot of history behind us. Those are our people, and that's what's in our bloodline.
Is the current city of Jericho not on that old?
Yeah, it's not exactly on that old
So
site.
we have not reconstructed a city that's almost in harem, you might say.
We have not reconstructed exactly on that spot.
Right.
Yeah, the city of Jericho is
But there
not
is
exactly
Jericho.
there. Yeah, but it's not exactly
I've
on
been
that
there.
spot. It's not exactly on that spot.
Got it.
Yeah. Any more thoughts before we close out for this evening?
Is there any, I know that there was a dig. You showed us, Kathleen Kenyon at Tellus Sultan. Whereabouts in Israel is that?
East of Jerusalem. I've
Thank
been in
you.
the desert.
Yeah.
It's very desolate, and it's very it's not a happy, pretty place at all. At least I was there, many years ago.
So thank you for being here, and I will see you again next week. Have a
Thank you for
wonderful
this.
week.
Thank you for this
Thank you.
fabulous class.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next week.